Now, you might assume that the book of Daniel is about some guy called Daniel, or in the very least, that it's about the nation of Israel. And in part it is, but you've probably noticed that the first few chapters have been centered around a pagan king called Nebuchadnezzar. I feel like we've been talking about him more than we've been talking about Daniel. And today we're going to be in chapter 4, and that will bring to the end our journey with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, to be honest, it's with a little bit of sadness that we're parting ways with his story. We will find out how his story ends, how his journey ends. But I began to grow fond of the guy, or a little bit compassionate towards him, which is a surprise because he's a despotic maniac, but somehow he's managed to capture our hearts a little. And in fact, that's how Daniel felt. Daniel was brought in, Daniel was kidnapped as a 15-year-old, a prisoner of war, by a foreign king. He lost his land, and over the years, as he served King Nebuchadnezzar, they seemed to have quite a close relationship. And so this morning, we're going to read through his final days, Nebuchadnezzar's final days, and we'll see how his journey ends. Now, last time we were together, we were in chapter 3. And if you remember, chapter 3 was the story of when King Nebuchadnezzar built that giant monument for himself and insisted that everybody bow down and worship it, and if they didn't, they were going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. So that's kind of where we left off. And with what we're reading today in chapter 4, about 30 years have passed. We transitioned from chapters 3 to 4 by the turn of a page, but many years are represented in that shift from one chapter to the next. And you'll see that this is very much a different season for Nebuchadnezzar. I would even say he's matured a little bit. He seems to have just chilled out. He seemed pretty wound up in the early parts of his reign. And also what might be the most unique attribute of this chapter that we're going to go through today is it was written by Nebuchadnezzar. It was written by a pagan. It feels a little bit odd that a tyrant, an unrelenting dictator, a guy guilty of genocide, a guy that attacked God's people would get the gig or land the opportunity to write a chapter in the Bible. And so that's what we're going to be reading through today. And so if you could turn with me to chapter 4. And not only did he write this, it's also the longest chapter in the book. And it's going to be Nebuchadnezzar's testimony, him sharing his journey with us. So chapter 4, I haven't even turned there. I'm just standing there waiting for you all. I've got to do the same. Now, it's a really big chapter. And I wanted to try and break this up into a couple of messages because of how long it is, and I'm not going to be able to. We are tackling the whole chapter today. I say probably we should be out of here by 1:30. We should be good. All the visitors are like, ooh, I think he's joking. Sounds like he could be. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Okay, let's stop there for a moment. That seems pretty good. I feel like he's on Team Jesus, right? To all peoples, nations, and languages. Now, that opening phrase is very much a standard or an official way that edicts were begun in that time in the ancient world. This is how they would start their broadcast to a State of the Union address. And obviously, in the absence of social media, such proclamations would be distributed throughout the land by people just like nailing them to trees. So all the people could read what this declaration was. And he's addressing the same audience that he addressed back in the beginning of chapter 3. But let me just remind you of that in verse 4. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O people, nations, and languages," so this is an edict going out, "that when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that the King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." So here in chapter 4, there's a dramatic shift in tone. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. I mean, he seems to be in a much better spiritual place, right? Giving praise and honor to God rather than his statue. Now, let's just recount, because this guy's gone on a journey. Just in these 4 chapters that we have gone through, he's gone on a journey. Let's recap some of the highlights so we can kind of see his progression. In chapter 1, he observed that the servants of Yahweh, the servants of the Jewish God, were superior to all his other candidates. So he noticed pretty quick, those guys and their God, they seem to be better than everyone else. Okay, noted. But he still hasn't surrendered to the Lord yet. And then in chapter 2, it is only Daniel who can reveal the dream and its interpretation. No one else could. Well, that captured his attention a little bit. He thought, okay, that's 2 for 2 for this Jewish God. So that impacted him significantly. And he closed out chapter 3 acknowledging God, but he doesn't quite surrender to him. He does allow Yahweh, this Jewish God, he does allow him to be part of his collection of gods, right? Because he's still a polytheist. And that's why he refers to God as the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He calls him their God, not his God, right? And then in chapter 4, what we just read, he upgrades his view of God and calls him the Most High God. So this proclamation, chapter 4 starts off with him heading in the right direction. And this journey from chapter 1 to what we're reading today was about 50 years. This guy's gone on a spiritual journey. We're going to keep reading. I'm going to read a big chunk of it. You guys ready? Verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, and they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was called Belteshazzar, remember that's his Babylonian name, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Worth noting there, no other god in the gods or ever referred to as holy. It is only Yahweh that was ever referred to as a holy God. Just a fun fact. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to the heaven. And it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, which is an angel, a holy one, come down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. Amid the tender grass of the field, let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the field, of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, O Belteshazzar, tell me its interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Okay. There's a lot going on there, right? Nebuchadnezzar is yet again troubled by another dream. Remember, he had that tormenting dream back in chapter 2. Poor guy's having another one right now. And in this dream, there's some tree in the middle of the earth that grows so high and so strong it reaches the heavens. And this tree was beautiful, and it provided shade for all the creatures of the kingdom, and birds lived in the tree, and it provided shade and comfort and beauty, and it was a magnificent tree. And then the tree is referred to as a hymn. So whoever this person is, his fate is to live as the beasts of the field. So this is a dream that he doesn't understand. So Nebuchadnezzar, he calls in the wise men to interpret this dream. It didn't work the first time, so he thought he would give it another go, and they arrived with all the little dream books, dream interpretation books, and they're like, okay, what was the dream? A big tree? Okay, big tree, what does that mean? Right, they've got to try and, the dream team are trying to interpret what this whole thing means, and that doesn't work. They can't figure it out. Or if they did, they didn't tell him, because you don't want to tell him what this dream means, right? Now, again, worth noting, it does appear that King Nebuchadnezzar has chilled out a little bit, because what did he do last time these guys weren't able to interpret his dream? Tear him from limb to limb, he says. So, I don't know, he's matured or something's happened here because he didn't go there. And then finally, Daniel, he is summoned. I'm not sure why he didn't ask for Daniel the first time, but Daniel comes in and he interprets the dream. So due to time, let me just paraphrase the interpretation of the dream. It's verses 19 to 27. Of course, read this in your own time, but I'll just share with you what this means. So Daniel, he reluctantly, you'll notice, shares this dream with Nebuchadnezzar. He tells him, the tree, that represents you, king. You are the tree. And although he has provided shade and beauty and food, although his kingdom has been a wonderful establishment, it's going to be chopped down. King, you are going to be dethroned. The Lord is going to humble King Nebuchadnezzar in the most dramatic way. God decrees to chop down King Nebuchadnezzar and relieve him of his reign and relieve him of his senses. He's going to lose his mind, and we'll go through that soon. And in verse 25, it says at the end, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling should be with the fields, with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox. Okay, what on earth does that mean? I guess we'll find out in a few moments. So although King Nebuchadnezzar may regard God, because he started off what seems positively, although he might regard God, he has not yet humbled himself and surrendered to God. That has not yet happened. King Nebuchadnezzar is still under the impression that his kingdom is subject to none. He's got it in his mind that he, as a king, is subject to none. And he is mistaken. And then Daniel wraps up the interpretation here in verse 27. Therefore, so after telling him what's going to happen, you, King Nebuchadnezzar, you're the tree, you're being chopped down, you're going to be dealt with, you're going to be sent to the fields. After telling him all this, he says, therefore, O king, Let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps, just perhaps, be a lengthening of your prosperity. Okay, so two warnings arise in this dream or in this interpretation. One, that God is sovereign and that he can dethrone Nebuchadnezzar just like that. That King Nebuchadnezzar is completely at the mercy of God, and God can do with him as he will. And then secondly, the second warning is you got to turn from your sin. Fine, you gave a wonderful opening speech and you said, "Oh, to the God of Most High." Okay, sounds good. You were talking Christianese, but it didn't mean anything because you're still full of pride. You don't realize that God rules over you. You have not subjected yourself to the one true king, and you're still in sin. You can say whatever you want, but you're not in right standing with me. And so God is going to cut him down. So what did Nebuchadnezzar do with this warning? Daniel came in and was honest with him. He said, "Hey, I know you're not going to want to hear this, but listen, this is what's going to happen to you. This is going to take place. And here's what you need to do about it." So what does he do about it? Verse 28, read with me here. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty?" Goodness, he doesn't get it, does he? Verse 31, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass, probably 7 years is what that means, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and it gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. Man. Now, I felt sorry for him at the end there a little bit, but then back at the beginning, is not this great Babylon which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence for the glory of my majesty? Dude, the guy just got warned about this. He just got told, you got to change the way you see this. You need to understand this kingdom was given to you by God. He was warned. He was warned what the attitude he needed to have, and he was warned of the consequences, and he just went all in with his pride. So what becomes of the king? What became of him? Madness became of the king. He experienced some kind of mental health issue where he thought he was an animal. Literally. Some kind of mental condition was induced by God. It's likely some kind of psychiatric syndrome akin with lycanthropy, which is a mental condition where people think they're a wolf or think they're an animal. That was lifted from mythology. But that's actually a diagnosis for a mental condition that people can have. And that happened to the guy. He went from the top of his game. He was a bright guy. He was a smart guy. He had established and led one of the greatest empires on all of earth. Now he's on all fours, eating grass like an animal. It reminds me of Job. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. So, now this isn't the end of Nebuchadnezzar's story. You'll be happy to hear. We will get to that shortly. But before we do, I want to draw 2 aspects of this story to your attention. There are 2 things that you and I have to lock in on in our own spiritual journey with this. First of all, it's good to note regarding Nebuchadnezzar's life is that God is the pursuer of man's heart. Now, the Bible, we know this, right? The Bible commands humans, us, to pursue God and promises that if we do, we will find him. Yes, that's true and that's good. But we often forget that God pursues us. God has pursued us first. And so, really, Nebuchadnezzar is a redemption story. Most scholars agree that he did experience salvation, that the Lord's saving grace did have his way with him, which means you and I may very well hang out with Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. And so God did an amazing work with him. But what did it take to incline his heart towards God finally? Rock bottom. And a rock bottom far worse than any of us have ever had to experience, unless you've thought you're an animal and were eating grass, then that's unfortunate for you too. But he needed to hit rock bottom, right? And keep in mind, God was slow to bring about this calamity in his life. God was long-suffering, 50 years. God revealed himself. Hey, look at Daniel and the guys. See how they're superior? Oh, the fiery furnace. Oh, and I remember they got delivered out of the fiery furnace, right? And take a look at these guys who didn't bow to the statue and everything that took place in the journey was just over and over and over again, Nebuchadnezzar being warned, you got it wrong. You need to turn back to me. God was pursuing Nebuchadnezzar. That's interesting because he wasn't awesome morally. He was quite treacherous, wasn't a Jew, wasn't part of Israel. In fact, was the agent that God had used to capture Israel from their homeland. And God is pursuing him aggressively. Keep in mind, he pursued him so much that he allowed him to lose his mind. One way or another, God needs to usher in spiritual growth in our life. See, Nebuchadnezzar's story is our story in many ways. And maybe not the genocide or the murderous tendencies, but with regards to how we push back to what God's trying to do. God's trying to have his way with you just like he is with Nebuchadnezzar. If you are not saved, then God is trying to reveal himself to you, and by his love and saving grace, trying to bring you in. If you are saved and there's sin and there's issues in your life, he's trying to work that out in you. He's trying to do refinement. God's doing a work with you, and just like Nebuchadnezzar, we push back. He pursues man's heart. Just like Nebuchadnezzar, we are all a work in progress. And so although he gave recognition to God, he did not surrender to God. This is actually not a unique thing. I think there's a lot of people that talk the talk. They talk, the Christian language. And Matthew 7 warns us about this, that there are people that might think they're pretty squared away with God, and they're not. They haven't surrendered their life to him. And so God is in a relentless pursuit of Nebuchadnezzar. It was the poet Francis Thompson who described God as the hound of heaven, just chasing down and pursuing the lost. He is the hound of heaven. So although Nebuchadnezzar starts by praising God, he doesn't surrender to him. And so what happens when we do that? When you don't surrender, when I don't surrender, all of us, when we don't finally take God's lead of what he's trying to do with us, when we harden our hearts, he upgrades the disruption and the discomfort in our life as an investment into our surrender. And that's what we learn in James and Peter about going through fiery trials. God will allow whatever needs to happen to us so that we can have that moment where we're like, oh man, my pride. Oh goodness, my sin. When I was at ease in my palace, so to speak, like King Nebuchadnezzar, I didn't concern myself about those things because I was at ease and I was enjoying what I had. I'm not worried about all the things that God's trying to do with me. And then God's like, well, why don't I put you in a situation and then we'll see if you want to worry about what I'm trying to do with you. And that's exactly what happened. So as we read through these 4 chapters and we are critical of Nebuchadnezzar and we think, man, goodness, Nebuchadnezzar's the worst. He's not dissimilar to you and I. And we can all suffer King Nebuchadnezzar syndrome a little bit. God is trying to do a good work with us, and we often resist. We can be very stubborn. And when we remain faithful to our sin or our wayward heart, what is God going to do? He's going to hijack your life and force a course correction. You guys experience that with your GPS when you disobey? What's that? Recalculating. You don't listen. I told you to turn left. You think you know better than me. I'm a satellite. You're not. And so this is what God does. He does whatever needs to happen to get you back on course. If it helps in your envisioning something, it's got kind of like in a car pursuit when the police roll out the spikes. That needed to happen because that driver was reckless and dangerous and it wasn't good for anybody. And so they needed to do something to stop him. And if that meant destroying his tires in the process, so be it. And that's what God does to us sometimes. That's what he's done to Nebuchadnezzar. He's rolling out some spikes because God's pursuing us and we're fleeing. And whatever needs to happen so that we will stop and listen and obey, then that is a great and a good thing. That's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. This is a love story, as it turned out, of a pagan king who the rest of us would have written off and would consider evil. The obvious spiritual truth hovering around in our minds with Nebuchadnezzar is Proverbs 16, pride goeth before destruction. This verse would have served Nebuchadnezzar quite well. Listen, remain humble or be humbled. And the Lord lovingly and graciously disrupted his life. The second lesson we can learn from Nebuchadnezzar, so the first is that God pursues man's heart. The second thing we learn here is that Nebuchadnezzar's life is that every good and perfect gift comes from above. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, his life, like I mentioned, he was obviously in a certain, very different season. His life looked very different than it did back in chapter 1. He had retired the sword, it would seem. And he's lazing around, it says, at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I mean, I can just see this guy just kind of laying there, being served, eating grapes, listening to the harp, just enjoying it. He'd spent much of his life at war, and now he is filling his days enjoying the Babylon day spas. Now, fair enough. He's enjoying the fruit of his labor. He worked hard, and now he just wants to bathe in the glory of his hard work. Fair enough, right? Isn't that, in a sense, what we all want to do? Isn't that what retirement is? Isn't this what Marion's going to do? Just be at ease in his palace? So why should Nebuchadnezzar not enjoy the fruit of his labor? He is a self-made man. Shouldn't he celebrate that? You know, Nebuchadnezzar undertook many ambitious building projects, a wonderful construction and building a beautiful city. He created an extensive system of walls to fortify the city. He created beautiful temples, beautiful roads, beautiful gates. So much of it just paved in gold. He'd worked hard. He'd done great. And you may be familiar with the Hanging Gardens. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But what he didn't recognize is the source of that prosperity. He thought his resume achieved all that. So in the process of all this happening, he became increasingly proud, and he thought that everything he had, this kingdom, his castle, his palace, everything, he thought it was a product of his greatness. And this is going to be the ongoing theme of Nebuchadnezzar's life. That was, if you go through the 4 chapters, this is the reoccurring theme that he can't seem to get squared away on. He just can't accept that God is sovereign and that he is subject to God's sovereignty. And the height of man's arrogance is when we take credit for everything God has done. Remember, the whole chapter starts off by God handing Israel over to Nebuchadnezzar. God's moving the pieces here. So Nebuchadnezzar, enjoying the blessing of what God is allowing to happen in his life, is walking around his palace. Look what I've done. Oh, it's marvelous. Look what I did. Me. I'm the greatest. That's how he had, at the end of his journey, that's where he got to in his mind. And the height of arrogance is to take credit for all what God has done. And people even double down with that sometimes, and they blame God for all the evil things that happen, right? And then take credit for all the good things that happen. And it's not a big leap to suggest that you and I have the same potential to think that everything that's good in our life is a result or a product of our great effort. It's easy to survey our life and think, all right, nice, I did it. To take stock of all that we have achieved and feel good about it is misappropriated praise. That's to get to a point where you're looking at all the amazing things God has done in your life. Oh, I've got my family, I've got some retirement, my bank account's okay, I've got my wealth. Oh, man, I'm glad I made all those decisions the way I did. I'm reminded of James 1:17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shadow due to changes. And again, John 3, just to give you another verse there, John answered, a person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. So it is a big deal to assume that all the blessings you have are a product of your good effort. That's wrong. That's what Nebuchadnezzar thought. Now, I understand that this is a doctrinal concept. I do think it's a little bit challenging to get our head around a little bit, because you might think that your health, your wealth, and your relationships are all the output of your acumen and your quality. I get it. That's the natural thing to assume. But at any moment, we can become powerless as these things can all just collapse around us. So how much control really do you have? That's what Nebuchadnezzar thought, that he had built his enterprise in a brilliant way, and I'm sure he did. But this was God's blessing. Anything that is good, it was God's favor. God allowing this to happen. And because he refused to acknowledge God, God said, fine, why don't I go ahead and take that from you? And maybe then you'll see that this is all the work that I'm doing in your life. Because every good and perfect gift comes from above. It doesn't come from any kind of corporate strategy. It doesn't come from whatever marketing you did for the Babylonian Empire. That's not where the riches came from. So it would behoove each of us not to forget this truth. And let me just mention 4 good reasons why we should not forget this truth. 1, if we remember that it is God, if we remember it's him, it's going to be a huge investment into us remaining humble. It'll help us focus on the giver, not the gift. So when you do have some wonderful blessing, it stops you looking at it going, oh, man. Or you look at my Ferrari. Whew, look at this. Man, I'm fixated on it. It reminds us, oh, man, anything that I have is because of God, so I'm going to give my praise and honor to God, not sit there and be thrilled about what I have. Doesn't mean we can't love what we have and care for it and everything else, but we've got to recognize that it is a gift from the giver. It helps us maintain a heart of attitude, because if you think you did it all, if you built your empire like Nebuchadnezzar thought he did, then who are you thanking? You don't need to thank anybody. You did it. You're awesome. So by remembering that God, it is the goodness of God and everything that is good and perfect comes from the Lord, it reminds us to say, oh, God, thank you. Thank you that I got up this morning and can breathe. Thank you that you blessed me with a family. Thank you that I was able to knock out the bills this week. Right? You have a heart of gratitude, and then also you can be a blessing to others because you realize that it was given to you anyway and you didn't deserve it, so why wouldn't you be more generous with what you have? That God wonderfully blesses us, does beautiful things for us, and we're like, oh, this is great. And then we see others in need, and we're like, oh, I'm not going to part with this. God gave it to me, He didn't give it to you, right? But if we remember, have that right heart, it's not really ours anyway. And so those are just 4 quick things. There's so many other reasons why it is so important for us to remember that every good and perfect thing comes from above. We're going to transition into a time of communion this morning. I want to go back to where we left off with our friend Nebuchadnezzar. The last moment we had with him, he was on all fours eating grass. But how did the story end? Verse 34. Read with me. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generations. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay in his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Whew. That last proclamation was a whole lot better than this first one, wasn't it? The first one felt fine. But then he realized, you know what? I am so thankful. I mean, God even added to my kingdom more than what I had. God did it. He didn't say, I got my kingdom greater. I'm no longer like a wolf or an animal. I came back, sat on my throne, and I made it bigger. He pointed back to God. He learned the lesson. He learned the very thing he needed to learn. He was humbled, and he realized that it is all God doing a work with him. I mean, as the old adage goes, all's well that ends well, right? I think things did for him. And so Nebuchadnezzar is a redemption story. You and I are a redemption story. And so as we come into this time of communion, I want to circle back or redirect your thoughts back to that truth that God pursues us. This is the heart of God, and this is why he sent his son to die for us. God sending his son to die for us is God pursuing us. It wasn't just a theological exercise that he needed to do. It is because of his love and his regard and his care for us. It is God pursuing us. It is his passionate pursuit that involves him sending his son to die for our sins. And you know you really want something. You know you truly desire something if you're willing to pay any price for it. And God paid the ultimate price which means he must really want you. He must be really pursuing you, just like we saw with Nebuchadnezzar. And so when we think about the death, the resurrection of Christ, and if we think about what that means to sin, and what that means to our eternal destiny, that is God pursuing us and loving us so much that he would do whatever he needs to do to catch us. That's what communion is ultimately about. He gave us life to overcome sin's grip on you. Sin has gripped you, it's gripped all of us, right? We're all struggling. We're all got the flesh that we're trying to handle. And because we have given our life to Christ, his righteousness has been imputed to us, and our sin has been imputed onto him. And God's wrath was heaped upon Jesus for everything that we did, paying the ultimate price, purchasing us. That's what the word redeem means. It means to purchase. And only someone who truly wants you would do that. It's the ultimate act of pursuit. I'm going to invite the worship team back up. God's passionate pursuit involved him sending his beloved Son to die in our place. In 2 Corinthians, it says, for our sake, he made him to be sin. For us, God made Jesus to be sin. And he knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So as we take communion this morning, that's what we're doing. And maybe this can be on your heart this morning as we take communion, as we think about what the death and resurrection of Christ means to us. Even just looking at the life of Nebuchadnezzar. One, anything that is good and beautiful in this life has come from above. It's God's goodness and his grace and his mercy upon our life, with the ultimate gift being the sacrifice of his Son, because of what that gift ultimately provides to you, eternal salvation. May that be on your heart. And then secondly, will you stop fleeing? Will you stop running? And that can look like a lot of different things. That could be that sin. You know how everyone's got that sin, where there's something that they've always kind of struggled with. Or there's respectable sins, or things that we'll tolerate in our life. And God is pursuing you with those things. He's trying to get you to surrender them. He's throwing road spikes out to see if he can slow you down a little bit here. Because it's not just about pursuing you for salvation, it's about pursuing you for sanctification as well. And you just don't want to do what Nebuchadnezzar did, where you just resisted, keep fleeing. And then because he cares and because he's the ultimate pursuer, at some point, might need to do something that forces you to see. And although that's ultimately the most kind and loving thing you can do, to discipline someone you love, obedience is always the best way to learn what God's trying to do with you, rather than a trial of hardship that forces the course correction. So we're going to take communion this morning, and I would really encourage you to have a very real moment between you and God. Communion is not something that you do with me or us. This is something between you and God. We do it together, but it is something that you have to really search your heart, examine yourself, and ponder deeply your relationship with God. And so in a moment, I'm going to pray, and we're going to have our servers come up. And we have communion tables along the front here. Jackie and the team are going to lead us in a couple of songs. And I would encourage you to, in your own time, just to come up and grab communion, head back to your seat, and sit, stand, kneel. If you can find the space, lie down. I don't mind. But draw all your attention to you and your relationship with God. Take communion in your own time. Just pray. You don't have to wait for anybody. And then once you're finished, stand and join us as we close in a song of worship. And now I will say, if you are not saved, if you haven't given your life to the Lord, then you can pass on communion, because communion is for the believer. But if you aren't saved, then after service, there'll be some prayer people, myself, Marion, Joe, find us, say, hey, I wanted to take communion, but I've not given my life to the Lord. Can you pray with me right now? Can you explain some things to me? Please don't leave today without getting that figured out. And so I'm going to pray, and then we're going to take communion, and we're going to close in a worship song. Well, Lord, we thank you that you are the pursuer. I don't think any of us would be so patient, gracious, and merciful to pursue even a friendship like you did for Nebuchadnezzar. And I ask, God, that maybe you would excite our minds and our hearts to what that must mean for how you think and feel about us. I'm reminded of the words of David. He said, who am I that I might be in your mind, God? Why are you even thinking about me? Because there's a very personal, loving God that for each of us, you desire to continue to do a great work. And we are thankful that you do bless us. And we are sorry that we don't even recognize half your blessings. And so, God, I pray that as we take communion this morning, may you speak to each of us. May we be sensitive to your Holy Spirit this morning. And I pray for this in your name, Jesus. Amen.